So where were we?
In the middle of the first out.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about that there are two types of providence in terms of din, in terms of judgment. So he said the one is called din arafia, and that simply means that there has to be order in the world. There's some kind of natural order. I'm not calling it natural in the sense of just nature. It's probably a little bit more than that. But it means
a designed plan.
Okay, it's some kind of thing that keeps things together. Except it's not enough. So why is it din arafia? Because Hashem, we didn't say this yesterday, but Hashem weakened it. Because He wanted to create the world just with a measure of judgment. He wanted everything to be based on din. But it was unsustainable. So He had to add a measure of mercy. Okay. And that's what we hear, that the first 20 generations couldn't exist without Hashem's mercy. So at first there were 10 generations, then Noach, everything was destroyed, but still Noach survived, but 10 generations they were able to survive, even though the din itself would have destroyed them earlier. And then another 10 until suddenly Avram comes. And there's something a little bit missing from that equation. How is Avram like Noach? So was Hashem about to destroy the world and then He didn't?
Could be.
So yes. When? He did like a mabul. It's interesting that this parallels, I've never seen it discussed, but there was a time before this that Hashem came down. When did He come down? In Avram's generation. Avram was in his 30s when this happened, in the Tower of Babel. And Bavel itself is like mabul. You mamish hear it. It's also it's like a deluge. It's like some kind of flood. Mm-hmm. But it's a flood of, call it, personal consciousness. Everybody starts speaking their own language and they can't understand one another. And Avram came out of that. Avram came of age out of that incident. And then something changed. And there was like a second flood, but this one was not physical, it was more spiritual, you could say. And then Avram shows up. And Avram changes the whole scheme of things. Avram changes everything. It's no longer the same. How did he change things? That's really the question. So the answer that I think we're hearing here is that Avram added a new measure of din, a new type of...
I thought he added chesed.
That too.
Like opposite.
Okay, that too. But the original din was like what sustained the world, and it was weaker because otherwise the world was unsustainable. This new din is something entirely different, because it's not coming to call it judge humanity. Rather, it's on a personal level. It's a new type of din. And this one doesn't need to be lessened because its purpose is completely different. Because it's dealing with the individual, it's already working in a very different way. So was there judgment of the individual before? It's a good question. There was judgment, but the judgment was very general. It was in the context of all of humanity. But here we have some kind of judgment that is personal. That's already something else. So let's see. Before we continue, I just want to see this in the Malbim, because it was somebody told me this on Shabbos. I didn't find it. I found it yesterday, and it's pretty amazing what he says. Ve'yeh bracha. What does it mean that Hashem said to? This is in Lech Lecha. What does it mean when it said to Avram? When Hashem said to Avram, "Be a blessing." So he says, "Ki b'she'ein ish ba'aretz shetachul alav hashgacha ishiit." Yanig Hashem et olamo lefi hateva hasdura. Says, when there is nobody in the earth, on the face of the planet, who is worthy of what is called personal providence, Hashem runs His world according to nature, lefi hateva hasdura, mibli yashkif al hanagot hatachtonim, without really taking regard for how the lower creations act. It's a very interesting thing. He's saying, look, the nature of things is such that Hashem always runs the world according to din. but it's not what we call personal providence. Why? Because it's dependent on personal providence is dependent on there being a person who's worthy of it. Now this is very interesting because Malbim was a chassid. Hold on. Malbim was a chassid. He's a chassid of the Rizhiner. He grew up by the Rizhiner. He was a chassid. So he knew the Baal Shem Tov Shita, and that it's different than the Maimonides. Maimonides says something very similar to this. He says, depending on your level of spiritual service, relative to that is the amount of personal providence that you receive from above. So the Malbim seems to agree with this, except for one small deviation, change, which now fits with the Baal Shem Tov. He says that the moment that there's a person who merits to have personal providence, that affects everybody then. The moment that somebody brought Hashem down, then the moment Hashem is here, Eino Bakol, he sees everything. Meaning he's going to judge everything by personal providence, not by the general nature of things.
In every generation is a Nasi.
Oh, so says the Baal Shem Tov, now you can understand what the Baal Shem Tov was saying. What did people say before the Baal Shem Tov? Said, yeah, you're right. There wasn't somebody like the Baal Shem Tov, like Avraham, who merited to bring personal providence down into the world. But the moment that he brings it down, and there's a continuation and of the same level of involvement, and we'll in a moment explain what that level of involvement really is. But the moment that there is somebody who's conscious of that, and he's the one who brings it down, the whole generation has it. So it's a very interesting marriage, and it explains a lot, I think, in terms of how can you say that the Baal Shem Tov went against Maimonides. Because even the Rambam would agree probably, that the moment that there's somebody, or it could be a Chidush, but he didn't write this way or that way, he just wrote it, when you read the Rambam it sounds like it's personal. It says the Malbim, he adds here the very important link, that the moment that there's one person like this, the entire generation can merit from it, can receive the same treatment. And this type of treatment, this type of involvement of God in a person's life is very different than the judgment that's for the general natural judgment, the Din Arafia. It's actually harder. It's harsher in some ways. But it's not meant to judge you. It's meant to guide you. And that's a huge difference. Like, the penal system is judgment. There's very little guidance that you receive. But really, the whole Ashgacha, the whole idea of personal divine providence, is that it's meant to guide you. Are there not things there that are painful, difficult, so on? Person goes through very difficult things. But he has to remember that this is personal judgment. It's not I'm left to the devices of nature. It's not that I'm in the hands of nature and this what happens is what happens. We're not willing to accept that. So, let's say Corona has a fatality rate per case of 0.05% or 0.5%, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. Pseudo, that's nature. When you talk about personal divine providence, that really doesn't matter. Because each person is not a statistic, but rather a specific story. How do we see this? What's amazing, he's not going to say it here, but I'll say it because he doesn't say it. Let me just continue the reading. Az titanega anaga klalit lefi ma'asav. Then the general way that Hashem runs the world is based on how He acts. Now you can understand this, that everything is dependent on Him, just in terms of it, whether it'll rain, we'll have food, not have food, stuff like that. You can also understand that it really changes the way that people live, meaning whether they have the personal divine providence also, whether they can read into their lives what is Hashem trying to tell me or not. That also depends on Him. And if there's a Nasi in the generation, there's somebody like the Baal Shem Tov in the generation, so yes, then everybody can tap into that. and can see their lives as some kind of life that's directed by Hashem from above, and Hashem is speaking to them. והוא הצינור המגיר ברכת שמיים מעל על כל העולם. And he's the tzינור, like the Baal Shem Tov used to say, בשביל חנין בני. He's the conduit through which all the blessing comes down into the world. ובזה הבטיחו כי כשיבוא לארץ חפץ יהיה הוא הבאר שממנו יביע מי הברכה לכל העולם. And that's what he meant, that was the bracha that he gave him. Heye bracha, you will be a blessing. What kind of blessing? You'll be the blessing, either to just provide, or even the way I'm reading it, and again, you could argue that's not what he's saying, but I think that that's how the Baal Shem Tov taught it, and that's what I think he's trying to say, although I could be wrong, is that the moment that you're tapping into the personal divine providence, everybody can. And that's the real blessing, meaning that life is not just being in the hands of nature, but you're holding a dialogue with your Creator. And he will be a treasure of blessing that will feed that will sustain everything else. Okay, so how do we see this? So that's an amazing thing, and I told you I didn't see this until this year. I think we began to discuss it. I just mentioned it in passing yesterday. At the end of Lech Lecha, when God makes the covenant of the circumcision with Avram, he says something amazing. And I never saw this. I don't know how I missed this. Ve'et briti akim et Yitzchak. He tells him that you're going to have a son, you're going to call him Yitzchak.
And he's the one.
And I'm going to make a covenant with him too. Asher teled lecha Sarah, and he's going to be born to Sarah, lamoed hazeh b'shana acheret, in exactly 1 year.
Right.
So what do we? Hashem told him this.
Right.
So why in the world
Does he need the angels?
does he need the angels in the beginning of Vayeira?
That's a very interesting question, which I was just thought about. Can you need to bring it down to Gashmas? One thing is
So that's what.
one thing is a vision.
Right.
The other is, I'm telling you, there's a letter for you in the post.
Okay.
You've got a check in it. Okay. When the postman comes, I'll deposit the check.
Okay, but that's a check. The angels didn't make it or not make it happen. So you're saying it's a lower level of prophecy. What I'm going to say now is I think much more fitting with what he says here. That is what Hashgacha Pratis means. That's what personal divine providence means. Meaning, I know from Hashem that this is supposed to happen, and now he sees 3 people, he doesn't see 3 angels. The Torah is completely the pshat. There's no question that these were 3 people. We add to it that they were angels because why? Because there's a certain question about he was in the middle of a revelation from Hashem. And he says to Hashem, Al na ta'avau ma'al avdecha. Do not pass over your servant. Which can be understood in 2 ways. Either he's saying it to the guests, don't keep traveling, come into my house, or he's saying it to God, which is how we also can understand it, meaning what's the idea? The idea is that now that he has 3 guests, what is he going to hear from them? What is he going to see from them? Hashgacha Pratis, he's going to see that these 3 men, for whatever reason in the world, are, who knows why, exactly like every Chabad story in the world, they suddenly bless him that in a year you're going to have a child. It's mamash kaftor v'perach. It fits so beautifully that he has brought divine personal providence down into the world, and he sees it. He hears the prophecy, and the prophecy is like in a state of a dream, or at least a daydream. And he opens his eyes and he sees 3 people there. He does the mitzvah with them, and he hears from them the same blessing. Exactly the same words. Lamoed hazeh ka'et chaya. They added ka'et chaya. But lamoed hazeh, same words. This time next year. That's amazing. That's Hashgacha. That's exactly every story that we say about Hashgacha is exactly this type of story.
They were told what to say. They knew the script.
If it's an angel, it's very easy. But that's exactly the fine line that you can't tell. Is this person just telling me what's in their head? Or are they the spokesperson for the Shekhinah? Which is it? Okay. That's exactly how Hashgacha works. You don't know. But you accept it that this is part of the story. Okay, so anyway, so getting back to the Mimer. So this is really an amazing time. Again, that this was not explained, because there's exactly the same word. There it says, Nirdana, let us go down. Here it says, I will go down. But in the end, it's the same thing. Nirdana ve'ere, Nirdana ve'nire et hamigdal asher asu bnei adam. In both cases, Hashem saying, I'm coming down. So we said the first part of it is because he just taught us about vessels. The big chap of the Zohar and Kabbalah in general is that there are vessels. Hashem has vessels. Now that he has vessels, he has to come down. Which one? He's coming down to the din. And he explained now that he's talking about which din? The din arafia. There's a din arafia in the world. There's a weak din in the world which keeps it running. But there's something more, and that's where we're here. V'hinei ktiv. We're here. V'hinei ktiv. Shiva ele enei Hashem, hema meshotatim b'chol haaretz. So all the Maimarim about Hashgacha Pratis, they start with this pasuk from Zechariah. I don't know if all they all end up in this pasuk, even though they don't start from it. There are 7 eyes of God that are scouring the earth, all over the earth. It's a very interesting symbol and a metaphor. There's another place in Divrei Hayamim that says, Ki Hashem einav meshotatot b'chol haaretz. There it says in Chronicles that Hashem's eyes are scouring the earth. It doesn't give the number 7. V'yesh le'avin, and we need to understand. Dinyan meshotatim u'meshotatot. And one pasuk, the real difference is that one it says scouring in the masculine, and in the other one it says scouring in the feminine. Mashma. And so from this we understand shenimshach lirot u'le'ayen hadavar al yedei riyah zo. In any case, the scouring means that somehow Hashem sees through this. But what does it mean? He knows everything anyway. We said, Galui ve'ado lifnei misha amar ve'olam, that everything is revealed before him. So what does it mean scouring? But scouring here means that it's a type of islabshus. Islabshus, like we know, means enclothement. Ba'adavar hanireh v'yadua. So it's always known, but there's not what we would call the engarbment of God's will into what he sees. He sees means he knows. But he's not going to act on it. There's no will involved. He just sees it. So in any case, even the fact that he needs to scour, then that must mean something different than that it's seen before him. I jumped a little bit. I jumped a little bit too quickly. So now we'll explain it. In the 10 sfirot, yesh orot vekelim. There are lights and there are vessels. Ki b'chinat chesed ve'gvura zehu b'chinat kli. When we say chesed and gvura, loving kindness and might, we mean the vessel. Aval ha'or hu ha'ara me'en sof baruch hu. But the light that goes in is always the infinite light. Here we're talking about the world of Atzilus. In the world of Atzilus, the light has the quality of being infinite in nature, meaning that it's not limited in any way. So the light that goes into the might, into the loving kindness, into the vessel, is of a different nature than the vessel, because the vessel is limited. Delav mikol inun midoti uklal. It's not like the vessel. It's not like the measures. Sometimes the vessels are called measures. It's not like the vessels. The vessels are not infinite. What does it mean by infinite? Infinite means that it can propagate forever. There's all kinds of meanings to infinite. When you say something is infinite, you can mean many different things. It doesn't always have to be the same thing. When you're talking about vessels, he explains in Igeres HaKodesh in the Epistle 20 in the Tanya that he means that it can propagate forever. So the vessels can't propagate forever. You have to renew them. So even if you gave tzedakah yesterday, you have to give tzedakah today, even though the tzedakah is in the world of emanation. רק שהאור מתלבש בהכלי שהוא חסד וגבורה ושאר מידות שהן נקראים מבחינת כלים שמגבילים את האור. What's infinite? The light that's inside the vessel. And it's the same thing for chesed and gvura, for loving kindness and for might, and for the other 5 measures of the heart, the other midos. They're all called vessels. Why? Because they limit the light. ועל ידם נמשך האור להיות מחיי נבראים בעלי גבול. And through them, the infinite light can give life to something that is limited. Who's limited, for instance? להיות התהוות מיכאל וגבריאל. What we call Michael and Gabriel, they're already in the world of creation. They're not in the world of emanation. So they're limited. So even to give life to the angels, to these powers called angels, it has to go through some kind of vessel. מחנה מיכאל מקבלים מבחינת חסד וגבריאל מבחינת גבורה. So the call it the hosts that are connected, the angels are connected to Michael. They receive from loving kindness, and those from Gabriel, they receive from might. שאי אפשר להיות המשכה זו מהאור עצמו כי אם על ידי הכלים. Because they can't receive it directly because they too are limited in some way. What does it mean that they're limited? That they can only do one thing, for instance. The angel also is limited. It's not limited because he then disappears. He continues on forever, but he can only do one thing. So somebody like Michael, he can only be chesed. He can't be might.
He has no choice.
But he's created in this way that he is limited. Mm-hmm. And his limit is not in terms of time. He propagates forever in that sense. But his limit is that he can only be one thing and he can't be something else. כמו שאי אפשר להיות השפעת כסף וזהב והנשמה, אלא אם כן מלובשת בגוף. In the same way, the neshama in this sense is higher. It's infinite. It has an infinite quality to it. But you can't give physical wealth to somebody just with your neshama. The neshama has to be enclosed and garbed within a body. So the body is what allows the interface from the infinite to the finite. So now that you have a body, you can give wealth to somebody. You can give somebody something else. But the soul by itself can't give. So then you give the tzedakah, you give the wealth with your physical hand. And then it's a mitzvah. So the mitzvahs always need something physical. והנה כמו כן, על ידי הכלים די 10 ספירות, הוא גם כן מבחינת העלאת זכות וחוב של כל נברא. And here he makes this very clear. That now that there are vessels, I can deal with an individual. Because before that, the dina rafia, the weak judgment that permeates all of reality, to keep it going, it can't deal with something limited. It's judging the world as a whole. To judge each one individually, in this case, this is what he explains, you need these vessels that limit the light, so that you can address each individual separately. That's where the finitude of judgment comes from. And when you talk about judgment, to be more finite means to see the individual. And it's like the difference between reading from the rule book, the law book, and looking at the case. The law book is general. It can't address each individual. But each case is an individual person with an individual case and with individual circumstances and so on. The judge is supposed to be the one who takes the light from the law book and applies it to an individual case. So in this case, the judge is the vessel. Without these types of judges, there's no personal providence. So in this case, the judge is not a human being. It's the vessel of the sphera of the power of judgment. It has a vessel. And that allows, as it were, to address each individual. Because we said before that their whole problem was, the whole problem the philosophers had was, how can Hashem judge each person individually? They said, no, you can't, because it's a plurality. Because now he has to split himself. No. That's not what he does. He sees everything all at once. as a totality.
It's like the sun coming in all the different windows, or it's the same sun. Things change.
Yeah, but you can't say that it's going to light up my house, but not my neighbor's house. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you can close the trees.
No, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to shine on the house. We're saying here it's like raining here, it's not raining there. Rain is a little bit different. Rain, by the way, is a great example of the difference between sunlight and rain. That sunlight, you can't say that here it'll be light and my neighbor will be dark. That doesn't happen. But with rain, that does happen a little bit. Why? Because rain is already more physical. The more spiritual something is, the more difficult it is to see this differentiation happening. So for this, we have this invention called a vessel of a sphere. And the vessels are an intermediate. They're like the bodies of these faculties, so that instead of being just general judgment, now it can become personal judgment. And that's personal providence. Because now the judgment, if it's a good judge, it's not just to apply the rule book. That's not what he's interested in. He's saying, look, buddy, you did this and this. In the law book it says so and so. What do you want to do now? You can't keep on doing this. So let's figure out a plan to help you recover. Let's figure out a plan to help you get back on track. Part of the plan is that you're going to have to pay a fine. So, because otherwise you don't feel it. Or you won't wake up. But the real purpose is for me to help you individually. And it's very interesting that would be called Dina Kashya. That would be called the harsher judgment. But it's not harsher in the sense, it's almost like saying, it's very interesting, that after the Mabul, Hashem said, whenever you see the lighter the general judgment, it will always be easier than the personal judgment. An example would be, it's very interesting. There's a lot of comparison between Corona and the two previous coronaviruses, which were MERS and SARS. And they killed themselves off very quickly. There was only I think 1,400 people died from SARS and like twice that from MERS. Why? Because that was hard din. That was hard judgment. The case fatality rate was 20 or 25%. It's 1 out of every 4. So when that happens, it's almost like saying that's not nature. That's the long finger of Hashem coming through judgment and hitting a specific person.
And now?
It's very.
Now the whole world is messed up.
Yeah, the whole world is messed up, but it's like a natural thing. And when it's natural, the fatality rate is very low, comparatively. I'm not saying that it's anything to shrug at, but it's not like a feeling of complete devastation. Though we're doing to ourselves a lot of devastation, maybe, because we're so afraid of it. Or maybe there are other considerations, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that nature itself is never so harsh. I'm floating an idea. That's why it's called Dina Rafia. Because in the end, nature is not that hard. What's really hard is what people do to themselves. And then the judgment that touches them. So then Hashem finds something to afflict them with. But it's almost like nature never does. It wouldn't be natural for Job to be just a... I guess that's how it works also, because when something is natural, we don't pay so much attention to it. It doesn't hurt us that much. But when something is out of the normal, like really harsh, and then the person wakes up. So you ought to also understand that at some level, something that's weak and everywhere is a part of nature. You're not so impressed by it. It doesn't cause you necessarily to change your ways. But when you're afflicted personally...
But everybody is afflicted by this thing.
So the person who gets it is afflicted personally. For them it's very harsh judgment. But I'm saying for the way that the world looks at it. So, So the vessel of judgment allows there to be personal consideration of each individual, and each individual judged individually. כי על ידי שהאדם עובר עבירה, קונה לו קטגור אחד, נעשה פגם וכתם באותו המלאך הממונה על זה. By doing an avera, by doing something wrong, a person has now created a blemish, an accuser, a judge against him. כי יש מלאכים שמקבלים ממידה זו, ויש ממידה זו כנ"ל, בעניין מיכאל וגבריאל. So there are angels whose sustenance, whose life comes from the good things that you do. And there are angels whose power comes from the bad things that you do. But in any case, what are you doing? You're creating a vessel. When you say that you're doing something, that it's creating an angel, you're saying that you're creating a vessel. That's really what it's saying. That there is divine personal providence. ומלאך זה מעלה הדבר למלאך גבוה ממנו עד שמתעלה בכלים ד10 ספירות המלכות דאצילות המתלבשים בביאה ובתוך הכלי מלובש האור מאין סוף ברוך הוא. And so these angels, it's called גבוה מעל גבוה שומר, and that's why it means לגדוש את הסאה. It's called that when a person has done too much evil, or a nation has done too much evil, that it overflows. Because the idea is like that it grows higher and higher. It's like you're creating a ladder. And when it touches the vessel above, your vessels connect with the vessel above, then it starts flowing down. The judgment begins to flow down. ונמצא על ידי הכלים מתעלה לאור אינסוף ברוך הוא המלובש בכלים דאינסוף. And then the infinite light comes down, ולכן נאמר על זה עיניו משוטטות שהוא בחינת הכלים דאינסוף. So why did it say that he has eyes that are searching, scouring? These eyes are the vessels. And the vessels are created by us, as it were. וגם המלאכים המקבלים מהם נקראים מערי דעינין, ויש מערי דעודנין. And the angels that receive from these vessels, not ours, but from the vessels that Hashem created above, so that there would be individual judgment, they're called the masters of eyes. And there are some called masters of ears. But in any case, what they do is they create a interface between the vessels that differentiate and make personal judgment possible above and the actions of people below. And they sort of fill in the gap between the judgments that I create, the vessels of judgment that I create by doing an Vayeira, and between the vessels of judgment that were created by Hashem above. And they're called the masters of eyes or the masters of ears. והם משוטטים בכל הארץ. And they scour the land. כמאמר דם מה למעלה ממך, עין רואה וכו'. And when it says in the Mishnah, you should know what's above you, that there is an eye that sees, what does it mean? That there are angels, okay, that there are these spiritual vessels that are looking to interface between what you have done and the higher faculty of judgment. Ayn ro'ah ve'ozen shomat. Uve'akelim, and when we're talking about vessels, shach lomar meshotetim, you can say that they're scouring the earth, because vessels are already something physical. They'd be here, they're there, they're where they are.
Physical, but they're created by Hashem.
Okay, these ones are created by Hashem. ובהם ועל ידם מתעלה הדבר בבחינת האור המלובש בתוכן. And through them, and by them, the light is transferred. And again, it rises above from what you did below to the measure of judgment above. והוא על דרך גלוי וידוע, שידיעה זו שבכלים דה אינסוף, שעל ידי עיניו משוטטים, הוא בחינת גלוי וידוע לאור אינסוף ברוך הוא המלובש בהכלים. And when we say that Hashem is aware of everything, we mean that the infinite light that's within these vessels, it knew anyway, before that, it knew everything. But the point was that it wasn't yet enclosed, it wasn't engarbed within a vessel like this, so that the judgment would be personal. כיוון שאור באמת לאו מכל עינוי מידות הוא כלל, אף על פי שמלובש בהכלי. Because really the light continues to be separate from the vessel, because the light has an infinite nature, and the vessel has a finite nature, and they don't really connect until Hashem does something. And that doing something, to be enclosed, that's called I will go down. Okay? then
Why it has to be Hashem goes down?
what?
Why it has to be that Hashem goes down?
The infinite light is not going to interface fully with the vessel. And so now it's going to connect fully with what actions have been done below. Until now it knew everything, but it hasn't interfaced with it at a personal level. It hasn't become one with the vessel in such a way that it would now influence the actions of one individual. In the continuation, he'll explain more about it. Tomorrow. Let's just finish just a little bit more. וזהו תירוץ לקושיית הפילוסופים. All this is to explain why the philosophers had such a hard idea שאין ידיעה והשגחה זו גורם מבחינת ריבוי. Of why is it that there's no multiplicity or plurality in God?
Did you really understand about the idea of hashgacha pratis?
No, they said it couldn't be. They all accepted that there's a shgacha. They all understood that God knows. The same way that Spinoza. Spinoza is the best example of the philosophers. But really, in the end, he has a feeling that God is all-knowing. But exactly because of that, he's not all-judging. Because he can't judge you personally, because you're one of a billion. There's no meaning to judging you personally. Don't ever think that somebody's out to get you. That can't be. It's a luck of the draw. That's all it is. It's just statistics. So for them, it was impossible. It's the same thing for a statistician today. A statistician has no way of telling you who in the world is going to get the bad or the good. Who's going to win the lottery? There's no way of knowing. They can't. There's no way to know. But I know that out of every 5 times that the lottery is done, one person will win $2 million. That I know. I just can't tell you who it is, because there's no hashgacha pratis. That's really saying there's no personal divine providence, and that makes sense to the mathematical, philosophical mind. That makes perfect sense. And so you can't accept that there's any personal providence. But what are we saying now? That Hashem created vessels. Because really, what makes it personal are the vessels. אבל הידיעה באמצע ברוך הוא מלובש בכלים מה שיודע ורואה מה שאינם משוטטות, הנה ידעתו יתברך זוהי בבחינת גלוי וידוע. But everything was known before. It's just a question of whether it's personalized or not. So I knew before. It's like saying that before Hashem, before the vessels, before enclothing within the vessels, so God knows everything just by knowing it. But that doesn't affect any particular individual. To have a private, personal conversation with somebody, you have to go through the interface called the vessels. And that's what Avram did. That's what I started today with. Avram started a personal conversation. And the moment that you have a personal conversation, then Hashem also guides you personally.
How to do that? Or where did he do that from? From his chesed? He wasn't doing chesed.
He learned it from Sarah.
Oh, wow.
That we'll talk about tomorrow.
Tomorrow is Tuesday?